Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. We're here to talk about the budget and the fiscal health of the state. As you all know, we have seen revenues not meet our forecast. In fact, we were here just last week talking about how in April we missed our revenue forecast by $55.5 million, or over 10%. In fact, we have missed our revenue forecast 14 out of 22 months. And when Nebraska families see their income go down, they tighten their belts. And they're expecting us to do the same thing. Now, the budget that was handed to me was balanced with budget gimmicks and a gas tax increase. And so I'm going to be returning that budget with thoughtful and measured vetoes to be able to correct that. I am proposing $56.5 million in vetoes, $11 million, you saw that on Friday, to be able to correct the gas tax increase and to be able to get us back to a 3% reserve. The way we are doing this is by going back to the recommendations that I made in January with regard to the funds available for provider rates, and then taking a 0.5% cut across the board to agency operations. And by 0.5%, that's 0.5%. And in agency operations, we included the University of Nebraska, community colleges, and state colleges. All that together will help us get to that $56.5 million. Now, we made 3 exceptions to that 0.5% cut. If the agency was already taking a 3% cut or more, we exempted it. If I had exempted that agency in LB 22, like corrections, we exempted it. Or if the cut would come to $1,000 or less, we exempted it as well. So as I said, this is all a thoughtful and measured approach to be able to get us back to that 3% reserve to guard against future downturns in our revenue forecast. And again, I just want to highlight that with the forecasting board revising down our revenue picture for this year to $4.3 billion, we are actually going to be taking in less money this year than we took in each of the 2 prior years. So this is not just about cutting the growth of government. This is about cutting government because we are taking less money in. As I said, Nebraskans expect us to tighten our belts the same way that they tighten their belts when they see their income go down. So I've line itemed those items out. I've also line itemed out the gas tax increase as well. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and open up to questions and answers. And like we normally do, we'll focus on the budget. If there's time left over, we can talk about other things as well.
How much would the gas tax have increased?
So with the way that it was structured in the Appropriations Committee, it would have increased by 0.2%. 0.2 of a cent, yes. And what I'll be vetoing out is roughly in $7.5 million in each of those years. Other questions on the budget? Yeah, Andrew. Well, I take all my vetoes very seriously. And in fact, this is probably one of the biggest decisions the legislature has to make because it goes to the fiscal health of our state. And we know that our revenues are declining. And so we have to make the tough decisions to be able to get a balanced budget that is going to be sustainable. And I don't believe we're there, and that's why I'm submitting these line item vetoes. And I'm asking the legislature to sustain those vetoes to help us get back to that 3% reserve to guard against future downturns in our revenue. Yeah. I think there's over 100 all in all when you look at it because it's a 0.5% across the board unless you met one of those 3 exemptions that I said. That you were exempted in LB 22, that you already took the 3%, or if it came to $1,000 or less, we didn't go there either.
So the university is included in that?
The university is included for that. So it'll be about $2.8 million for the university in the first year and about $2.9 million in the second year. So again, That's being vetoed, right. So that would take the university from roughly where in the committee bill it's at $573 million the first year, taking that to about $570 million, which is what they're getting this year. And then in the second year of the bill, they're at 583. This would take them down to about 580.
Is there a concern with having those increases or budget cuts for even now when they are trying to bring students into the state of Nebraska? Maybe tuition might rise because of that?
Well, it's the Board of Regents and the university administration that will make decisions with regard to what they do on matters of tuition and how they manage the budget. What we're asking them to do is live within the means of the entire state. Again, some of my agencies have taken cuts that are in excess of 8%. And what we're asking here is a 0.5% additional from the university. So, and in line with basically keeping their budget flat from this year to next year and then getting an increase in the year after that.
Talking about getting next to the gas tax increase, how do you think this year's budget process has gone so far for the appropriation?
Well, this is a difficult budget year. Nobody likes making cuts, and we have to make tough decisions. You know, it's part of the give and take of the legislative process that the Appropriations Committee worked on their budget and returned it to me, and now I'm making the changes that I think are appropriate to send it back to them and asking them to sustain those line item changes, because we need to make sure that we have that 3% reserve to guard against the future that is very uncertain.
Do you see possibly a special session being called at all this year if it doesn't turn out the way you want it to be?
Well, anything with regard to a future session will depend on what happens with our revenues, but just let me put this in perspective. Where we are right now is between May and June, we have to bring in $835 million to even just meet our revised down forecast of $4.3 billion. Last year, in those 2 months, we brought in $793 million. That would mean that we'd have to increase our revenues by over 5.3% for these 2 months to be able just to meet that revised down forecast. And as I said, we've missed our revenue forecast 14 out of the last 22 months, including the most recent one, April, where we missed by over 10%. So it seems unlikely, it could happen, but it seems unlikely that over the next 2 months we're actually even going to meet this year's forecast. So we've got very serious fiscal issues going on right now. We've got to take appropriate steps to be able to manage our budget, to be able to provide all the services we need to do and stay within that budget. And that's what my vetoes do. They help us have that 3% reserve so that we can guard against that future downturn in our revenues.
So what's left on provider rates? Is there any increase in your budget for provider rates? And do you talk about, some people feel that if you cut provider rates, personnel.
Well, remember what we're doing is we're talking about the funds available for provider rates. So we're not talking about cutting specific rates. This is about the funds that are available, and what we have to do is make sure we're doing a good job of managing those. But also, we have to remember that everybody's got to be a part of this. Everybody's got to be a part of the solution, and that's what this budget proposal reflects. With that 0.5% decrease across all those agencies, unless you've already taken a 3% decrease. And what I'm doing is taking those provider rates back to what I proposed in January, which is about reducing the funding for that by about 3%. So it's everybody being a part of the solution.
But, I mean, people say this could close nursing homes. Wouldn't that be something you want to avoid? Do you think their decrease will still allow these homes to exist and keep operating?
Certainly, I think that we have to manage our budgets, and the folks who are doing business with the state have to manage their budgets as well. So a lot of things get said with regard to what could happen because of budget cuts. Nobody likes to cut a budget. But the fact of the matter is, we are taking in less money this year. We don't have the money. And so everybody's got to be a part of the solution to be able to help us get back to a balanced budget.
You did cut or vetoed the lowering the budget reserve to 2.5% up to 3%. So that trigger, you ended up buying $42 million in line item vetoes.
Actually, what I did was cut the spending enough to get us back up to that 3% reserve. So what the Appropriations Committee, as part of their budget, they took down the requirement, but that was sunsetted after 2 years anyway. So what I did is just cut the spending to get us back up to 3%.
But you wanted at 3%.
I want it to be at 3%, right?
But you didn't veto the authority to have it go down to 2.5%. That's still there.
Exactly right.
Why
Again, it sunsets in 2 years, and the practical effect we really want is to have a 3% cash reserve in our checking account, and my spending cuts actually get us there.
Even with these cuts, where you're talking about the revenue slowing down, with these cuts, do you think you will be able to, the cuts are aligning with how the revenue will come in? It seems like you're still worried.
Oh, I'm still worried.
Revenue won't quite meet what this budget is.
I am still worried. I think there's still reason to be concerned. As I said, these are thoughtful, measured cuts to be able to get us to that 3% reserve. But what happens in the future will depend a lot about how and where those revenues come in future months.
Different. If they don't make sustained vetoes, are we headed toward a special session?
Again, all that will depend on what happens in future months. We've missed our revenue targets 14 out of 22 months. So whatever happens down the road with regard to whether or not we have to come back again before next January or not will depend upon where those revenues go. By making these cuts now, we help guard against that because we're making those cuts now, but a lot will depend on what happens with those revenues in future months.
You said you lowered the funds available for the provider rates. What does that mean in terms of, I think they were break even with the appropriations committee, but will that mean that they will go down 1%, 2%?
Well, again, what my recommendation was going back to January was to take those funds available for the provider rates down roughly 3%. Yeah. Roughly. Well, again, it's not all of them, but it's just roughly. Jerry, you want to give us some specifics?
Points, Governor.
Yeah.
On Fred's question about vetoing from 3 to 2.5%, that's a statutory requirement the legislature enacted for that to be the minimum. So that the governor wasn't in a position to veto that minimum requirement of 2.5%. But he did veto spending that allows for the budget to be at 3.0 minimum in the general fund, okay?
Well, we could have done that, though, but it was in part of another bill, right?
Well, but it's a statutory change.
Yeah.
So that was outside our reach except to veto spending and set the budget at a 3% minimum reserve, vis-a-vis a 2.5% minimum reserve requirement.
I thought it was in a budget bill.
It was in a budget bill, but it was a substantive change in statute.
I could have vetoed that whole budget bill.
Could have vetoed the whole bill, but
we
there
chose
was
not to do that.
There was considerably more in that
Than
piece
just
of
that
legislation.
piece of it.
Yeah. And the question on provider rates is it's about how much funding is available to the department when it goes about the process of determining the individual provider rates. That will take into consideration as well utilization of services across those various categories of provider rates too. So it could vary. And I know, for example, the funding the committee had included for physicians in hospitals, for example, was a funding level that was 3% less. Governor's recommendation doesn't take that any further in terms of how much funding is available for hospital and physician services, for example. So,
Thanks, Jerry.
On the gas tax, are you restoring money to the, how does it work? Are you restoring money to the Department of Roads that would otherwise have been taken away, necessitating?
Yeah, if you look at what the committee's recommendation was, it's actually to spend less money on roads than what I recommended. And so by vetoing out the gas tax increase and restoring that funding, we take it back to what my original recommendation was going back to January.
So does that wind up, does that affect being more money for roads?
Yes. Well, it was $7.5 million that I'm vetoing out. When he gets back, it's not quite that much money because he was taking more money out for appropriations. Did you want to go? Do you want to get that far into the weeds there, Jerry? You might as well. The question was asked.
okay. So the legislature was proposing to transfer $30 million, okay, $15 million each year. The governor has vetoed $7.5 million each year.
So that's half.
Okay. So it's half of that. And also in 327 has vetoed the trigger for establishing the variable gas tax rate, which is called the Highway Cash Fund Appropriation, has reduced that to eliminate the proposed gas tax increase. That's in 327.
That's the annual adjustment that happens every year. That is every 6 months.
know that the gas tax will go down, but if we left the way the committee had left it, the gas tax would be going up. Yeah.
Are you at all more optimistic about, this is a 2-year budget, so, while you have 2 months to make up that ground, you got 2 years to kind of all balance it out. But you just announced that the Chinese market for beef might be opened up. Do you have any more optimism that our economy may turn around, I guess?
Well, certainly that's what we're hoping for, that when we see markets open up, like the Chinese market for our beef, we're the #1 beef exporting state. That market in 2015 was worth $2.58 billion. That's a tremendous opportunity for our beef producers here in the state, which is one of the reasons why we were in China last November helping to lay the groundwork to open up those markets and make connections with distributors for our beef producers here in Nebraska. So certainly those things are optimistic, and cattle prices have rebounded somewhat, but we have more than just cattle in the state as far as our overall agricultural economy, and we haven't really seen too much movement in corn or beans. So there's still reason to be concerned, and until we actually see those revenues start coming up, I think we all got to be prudent about how we're spending our money. We got to constrain our spending.
You began the news conference saying that the legislature relied on, I think it was budget gimmicks and a gas tax hike. It sounds like pretty critical of how the legislature approached this budget.
Well, I do think that taking that reserve down from 3% to 2.5% puts us on shaky financial ground. In a time when we know that we're having trouble with regard to hitting our revenue forecasts, again, the 14 out of 22 months, we actually should be thinking about actually even taking that reserve up to guard against revenue downturns. So we're going the wrong direction. We want to manage this budget prudently, which means that we need to allow for the fact that our revenues may not hit those forecasts. And that's why that's a budget gimmick, to allow us to balance the budget, to essentially allow for $40 million more in spending.
How about corrections? What did you do on corrections?
Again, corrections, we kept the same stance as we took when I introduced the budget in January, which is we want to continue the reforms that are going on in corrections and protect the public safety. And so we did not take any cuts into corrections in this. Again, that was one of those agencies that was exempted in LB 22, so that was one of my 3 areas of exemptions that we did not go to.
Did you at least do anything with the Water Sustainability Fund?
The Water Sustainability Fund took a 3% cut already, so they did not get touched in this additional veto as part of the package. So, ladies first.
The 0.5% is about 42 million, so 56 million you actually would go above that 3% reserve.
Well, remember, we also have to account for the roughly $15 million for the gas tax. So then you're getting, if you add the 40 plus the 15, you're getting up to that 55, 56 range.
Moving the state forward with this budget, how difficult is it going to be for you to be able to do the things you want to do, or your administration wants to do in the next 2 years?
Yeah, certainly we're not going to have as much money as we'd like to be able to spend on things, whether it's going to be investing in education or taking care of, funding for providers and so forth. If you look at Department of Economic Development, that's cutting this budget significantly as well, over 8%. Department of Agriculture is getting cut over 8%. So we're going to have to figure out ways to, like all of our agencies, are going to have to figure out ways to be able to do more with less. We're going to have to manage within our means, just like every Nebraska household has to do when they see their income go down.
Can they do that?
Oh, absolutely. We will make do. We will set priorities. We'll decide on what are the most important things to do, and we will focus on those, and we will manage and live within our budget, just like Nebraska families.
Check on Joanne's math there, because I didn't follow it. On the 0.5%.
Never check on a journalist.
Huh? I was doing it on the phone last week, right?
No, because we also got the $11 million for the HVAC project. So, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say the 0.5% reduction has a number of exclusions in it, right? So this additional 0.5% actually is over the 2 years is $11.7 million reduction. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Jerry.
Right.
In your cuts and your vetoes, any cuts to K through 12 education funding at all?
No, there are no cuts to the K through 12 education or the property tax credit relief fund or corrections.
Talk about at the Economic Forecasting Board, there were a number of members who said we're into a new normal now. We're just not going to see that. you feel that way? Do you think Nebraska is going to be a long-term thing where the revenues are going to be low and we're going to have to really steer with that?
Well, I have no crystal ball that will tell me where our revenues to state government are going to go. What I can tell you is that agriculture is the largest part of our state economy, roughly 20% or more. And when we see commodity prices down such as they are, that means that our farmers and ranchers, they're tightening their belts. They don't have the income they did, a couple of years ago, so they're not spending the money. For example, in 2012 and 2013, farm income in this state was at $7.5 billion. In 2015, it was at $4.5 billion, a 39% decrease. 2016 will probably be closer to $4 billion, like a 45% decrease. Well, if you see your income go down by that much, you're just not going to spend the money. That's what our farm and ranch families are doing, and that ripples through our entire economy. So until we see that turn in agriculture with commodity prices rebounding, we're likely to see our revenues continue to struggle at the state as well.
To piggyback off of that, if this continues, what can you do to help rebound that? I mean, this isn't feasible for the state to continue to making cuts like this.
Well, first of all, we have to manage within our budget, just like our Nebraska families have to do. And then we always are looking for ways to how we can grow our state. So, for example, in November, as I said before, we did a trade mission to China in anticipation of opening up of the beef market there. We did a program in Macau that highlighted Nebraska beef to a number of distributors into China so that they could see what a great product we have. We got the best beef in the world. So that's a way when that market, so getting ready for when that market opens up, that we could penetrate that market and make sure that we, again, are promoting Nebraska beef into China. So that's one way that we can help grow. And, of course, that's going to help out with corn and so forth because that's what the cattle are going to be looking to eat. Then we also look for ways to be able to be more user-friendly in our state, so to speak, lower the regulatory burden, be easy to do business with, having a regulatory environment that allows companies to come here or choose here because it's easy to do business with us. Forbes ranks us the #1 best place for regulatory environment. And if you look at just a few weeks ago, we announced that we'd received the Governor's Cup from Site Selection Magazine for the most economic expansions, development projects per capita. In fact, we had more economic development projects in Nebraska than North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas combined. So we want to continue to have that place where companies choose to expand here. And then, again, just continuing to encourage young people to look at skills and careers in the skilled labor force, science, technology, manufacturing, logistics, and that's what we're doing with our Developing Youth Talent Initiative, encouraging the private sector to work with school districts to create curriculum to help those kids, starting in 7th and 8th grade, to choose those careers so that we have the right trained, skilled workforce here that, again, is one of the things companies are looking for when they want to move to our state. So all those things are things we can do to continue to make ourselves attractive. We need to continue to focus on taxes. We've got to take, obviously the tax bill got stalled, but we're not giving up on that. We have to be more competitive when it comes to taxes as well. All these things will help us grow Nebraska over the long term.
I believe as the budget was sent over to you, it was like a 1.1% increase in spending. So with these vetoes, if they were to be sustained, what would that increase be?
Jared, you know the number off the top of your head.
0.6?
0.6%. Thanks.
Why leave the property tax relief fund alone while you're making cuts? Why not take from it to get through
the number one thing people talk to me about as I cross the state is property taxes. That's the single biggest issue. And the legislature did not advance the tax bill I worked on with Senator Smith that would have had additional property tax relief in it. It's important that Nebraskans continue to see that property tax relief, and so we made that commitment to that fund to make sure that Nebraskans would at least see the part from the state being upheld.
Tax relief, sacrosanct when you're cutting other parts of the budget?
We're already taxing our citizens too high, so I am not going to raise people's taxes. And that is part of the problem with growing, is we've got to be able to be more competitive on taxes. And cutting the property tax credit relief fund will make us less competitive.
Are you saying $55 million?
I'll give that to you for a second, and then go ahead and on you, Fred.
Did you talk to the university or state colleges at all, and were you able to address some of their concerns?
I have not given them any specific numbers with regard to the budget, but I have been in communications with folks. I sat down last week, for example, with President Bounds. So we have been having ongoing communications, but I haven't given them the specifics that were in this that were in this proposal. Yeah.
$55 million per year, or
56.5 million. Total for the 2 years. For the 2 years. For the 2 years. One more question. Who wants to go last?
Are we going to get a list of all these?
Yes.
Yes, in fact, there is an attachment to the veto letter for 327 that has all the line items on it, so you can see how much in every particular area. Well, again, folks, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for making the time today. And certainly, again, we have to manage within our budget here, which is what this budget proposal does. It's measured. It's thoughtful. It gets us back to that 3% reserve, and it avoids a gas tax increase. All this is the way we manage when we have difficult decisions to make, and we have economic times where we see we're not bringing the revenue we thought we were going to. So thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.